Over 60, top 8 foods that act like natural medicine for your eyes. Let me start with a bold truth. 99% of people over 60 have no idea that the secret to clearer, sharper vision isn't in a pill, a fancy supplement, or a new pair of glasses. It's on their dinner plate. Think about it. Some doctors will tell you blurry vision, glare at night, or even macular degeneration are just an unavoidable part of aging. Others will say there's nothing you can do except wait for surgery or injections. But after more than 40 years in medicine, I can tell you this. Both of those ideas are wrong. Dead wrong. Here's what most people don't know. There are everyday foods sitting quietly in your fridge or at your local grocery store that act like natural medicine for your eyes. Foods that can actually protect your retina, defend against cataracts, reduce dry eye, and even slow down macular degeneration. Not exotic powders or overpriced vitamins, but simple, familiar foods you may already love. And the best part, these aren't rare or expensive. They're ordinary foods that science has now proven can transform the way you see the world after 60, yet almost no one is talking about them. So let me ask you, if something as simple as what you eat could help protect your eyesight for the next 20 years, wouldn't you want to know exactly what those foods are? Stay with me because we're about to count down the top 8 foods that can keep your vision stronger, clearer, and sharper long after 60. And trust me, you'll be shocked by what takes the #1 spot. But before we jump in, do me a quick favor. If you want more real, science-backed health tips that actually work, hit that like button, share this video with a friend, and subscribe to the channel. Your support is what allows us to keep bringing you information that could change your life. All right, let's get started. Why eyes get blurry after 60. Before we talk about the foods that protect your vision, it's important to understand why eyesight so often fades after 60. The first reason is the natural aging of the lens. Over time, the lens inside your eye becomes less flexible and more cloudy. That's why reading small print becomes harder and why driving at night feels unsafe. This process leads to presbyopia and cataracts, and by age 80 more than half of Americans either have a cataract or have had surgery to remove one. Another major reason is macular degeneration. The macula is the tiny but powerful part of your retina that gives you sharp central vision. With age, waste deposits build up and damage this area. Right now, more than 11 million Americans are living with macular degeneration, and experts predict that number will double by 2050. The scary part is that AMD often starts quietly. You may only notice a little blurriness or distortion before the damage becomes significant. Dry eyes also play a big role. After 60, tear production slows, and many common medications make it worse. Dehydration and too much screen time add to the problem, leaving your eyes feeling gritty and blurred. Research shows that nearly 1 in 3 adults over 65 struggle with dry eyes, and it's more than just a nuisance. Chronic dryness can blur vision, cause headaches, and increase the risk of infection. Circulation is another factor. Your eyes depend on some of the smallest blood vessels in the body, and when circulation weakens because of high blood pressure, cholesterol, or diabetes, vision can suffer. In fact, eye exams often reveal the earliest signs of vascular disease, sometimes even before heart or brain symptoms show up. Protecting your blood vessels protects your eyesight. Finally, there is oxidative stress. Decades of exposure to sunlight, pollution, smoking, and poor diet create free radicals, tiny particles that damage eye cells. Oxidative stress is a major driver of cataracts, macular degeneration, and glaucoma. That's why antioxidants like vitamin C and E, lutein, and zeaxanthin are so critical for eye health. I'll share one story. Margaret, a 72-year-old patient of mine, came in convinced she just needed stronger glasses. What we found instead was early macular degeneration. Instead of focusing only on lenses, we rebuilt her diet with spinach, salmon, and blueberries. 6 months later, her scans showed the disease had slowed. She told me her vision not only held steady, it felt clearer. Food didn't cure her, but it gave her eyes the support they needed. So when you think about blurry vision after 60, remember it's not always just age. It's the lens, the macula, the tear glands, the blood supply, and the slow burn of oxidative stress. And the good news is you can take steps, starting with what you put on your plate, to give your eyes a fighting chance. 8. Carrots, the classic eye food. Carrots have been known as eye food for generations, and science confirms why. They are packed with beta-carotene, which the body converts into vitamin A, an essential nutrient for the retina. Without enough vitamin A, night vision begins to fade, colors look less sharp, and in more severe cases, the eye's surface can even become damaged. According to the World Health Organization, vitamin A deficiency remains one of the leading causes of preventable blindness worldwide. Just 1 cup of carrots provides more than 300% of your daily vitamin A needs, which makes them a powerful and simple addition to any meal. Studies published in JAMA Ophthalmology show that diets rich in vitamin A lower the risk of night blindness and cataracts, while European research has linked higher beta-carotene intake to nearly a 25% reduced chance of developing advanced macular degeneration. I think back to a patient of mine, Ruth, a 70-year-old retired librarian who avoided driving after dark because headlights looked like large, blurry halos. Her vitamin A levels tested low, so instead of relying only on glasses, we adjusted her diet to include roasted carrots, leafy greens, and healthy fats to help with absorption. Within 3 months, she reported clearer vision at night and felt confident driving again. The lesson here is simple. Food doesn't just fill us up, it fuels our eyes. Carrots work best when paired with healthy fats because that's how beta-carotene is absorbed. Roasting them with olive oil, blending them into soups, or even dipping raw carrots in hummus can turn a basic snack into true eye protection. So ask yourself, when was the last time you made carrots a regular part of your meals? They may not be a cure, but eaten consistently, they give your eyes the natural support they need, especially as the years go by and good vision becomes more precious than ever. 7. Eggs. Lutein in the yolks. Egg yolks are one of the richest natural sources of lutein and zeaxanthin, two antioxidants that concentrate in the retina and form a protective layer against harmful blue light and oxidative stress. These nutrients strengthen what's known as macular pigment, which directly affects how clearly we see details and colors. A study published in the American Journal of Clinical Nutrition showed that people who ate eggs daily had higher macular pigment density, giving them stronger protection against age-related macular degeneration. What makes eggs especially powerful is that the fat in the yolk helps the body absorb lutein and zeaxanthin more efficiently than when they come from vegetables alone. I think of George, one of my patients, who was 69 when he came to me worried about glare and blurry vision. He had been eating sugary cereal every morning, so we switched his breakfast to 2 boiled eggs. A year later, his eye exam revealed a healthier macula, and he told me he could read street signs more easily at night. Another patient, Maria, age 71, struggled with eye fatigue when reading. She began eating an omelet with spinach a few mornings a week, and soon noticed she could read longer without strain. Her follow-up scan confirmed her macular pigment had improved. Many people still carry the outdated fear that eggs are bad for cholesterol, but the latest research shows that for most older adults, moderate egg consumption is safe and can even be protective. So I often ask my patients, are you starting your mornings with empty calories, or with something that actively defends your eyesight? An egg a day is one of the simplest, most affordable steps you can take to keep your vision strong well into your later years. 6. Salmon. Omega-3 eye protection. Your retina is made up of a high concentration of omega-3 fatty acids, especially DHA, which plays a critical role in maintaining the structure and function of your photoreceptor cells. Without enough omega-3, those cells become more vulnerable to damage, and vision decline can accelerate. Fish like salmon, sardines, and mackerel are some of the best natural sources. A Harvard study following tens of thousands of participants found that eating omega-3 rich fish at least twice a week lowered the risk of age-related macular degeneration by 42%. That's not a small number, that's almost cutting your risk in half. Omega-3s also play an important role in reducing dry eye symptoms. They improve the quality of tears, making them more stable and less likely to evaporate too quickly. A large clinical trial published in Investigative Ophthalmology and Visual Science showed that older adults with dry eye who added omega-3s to their diet reported less irritation and clearer vision. I'll share an example. One of my patients, Harold, a 74-year-old retired engineer, came to me frustrated because he had to stop reading in the evenings due to burning, watery eyes. Instead of giving him another artificial tear prescription, we added salmon twice a week and a small handful of walnuts for extra omega-3 support. Within 3 months, he noticed his eyes felt less gritty and his evening reading habit was back. Here's something else to consider. Omega-3s don't just protect your eyes, they also support your heart and brain. When I talk to my patients about adding salmon or sardines to their meals, I remind them they are investing in their whole body, not just their vision. Now, I often hear concerns about cost or convenience. Fresh salmon can be expensive, but canned salmon, sardines, or even frozen mackerel offer the same benefits at a fraction of the price. The key is consistency. Are you giving your eyes this nourishment every week, or are you letting months go by without it? Adding fish to your plate just 2 times a week is a small change, but for your eyes, it can mean the difference between struggling with glare and dryness, or seeing comfortably and clearly well into your 70s and 80s. 5. Blueberries, the circulation berry. Blueberries have earned the nickname the circulation berry for good reason. They are loaded with anthocyanins, the deep blue pigments that strengthen the tiny blood vessels in your eyes, improve circulation, and shield delicate tissues from oxidative damage. Good circulation means your retina receives the steady oxygen and nutrients it needs to process light and send clear images to your brain. Without it, vision can blur and fatigue sets in more quickly. A 2019 study confirmed that blueberry extracts improved night vision and reduced visual fatigue in older adults, giving scientific weight to what many patients have experienced firsthand. I recall Helen, a 74-year-old patient, who came to me frustrated with constant eye strain while reading. Instead of reaching for stronger glasses right away, we tried a nutritional approach. She began eating a cup of blueberries every day, whether stirred into oatmeal or blended into a smoothie. Within 3 months, she reported sharper vision, less strain, and the ability to read for longer stretches without discomfort. Her story isn't unique. I've seen similar results in many older adults who consistently add berries to their diet. Research also suggests blueberries can help slow age-related macular degeneration by reducing oxidative stress and inflammation in the retina. A large analysis published in Nutrients highlighted the protective effect of anthocyanins not just for the eyes, but also for overall vascular health. That means when you eat blueberries, you're not only supporting your vision, but also your heart and brain. So here's something to think about. Are you getting enough berries each week to truly nourish your eyes? Most people grab them only occasionally, maybe as a summer treat, but making them part of your daily routine could be one of the simplest habits for lifelong vision support. Whether fresh, frozen, or dried without added sugar, blueberries are a small, delicious step with big payoffs for your eyes. 4. Spinach and kale, nature's sunglasses. Spinach and kale are two of the most powerful foods you can eat for your eyes. They are loaded with lutein and zeaxanthin, two carotenoids that concentrate in the macula and act like internal sunglasses. These nutrients literally filter out harmful blue light from screens, sunlight, and artificial lighting, helping protect the retina from long-term damage. The famous ARDS 2 trial, funded by the National Eye Institute, showed that higher intake of lutein and zeaxanthin significantly slowed the progression of age-related macular degeneration, which is the leading cause of vision loss in older adults. Just 1 cup of cooked spinach provides about 20 milligrams of lutein, which is more than many people get in an entire week. I remember a patient named Carol, 73, who worked on her computer for several hours a day. She complained of glare, eye fatigue, and difficulty focusing after long screen sessions. Instead of just recommending artificial tears or blue light glasses, I encouraged her to add more leafy greens to her diet. She started blending kale into her morning smoothies and sautéing spinach with olive oil at dinner. Within a few months, she reported that her eyes felt less tired, and she could comfortably finish her daily tasks without the same level of strain. Studies from the Journal of Ophthalmology have also linked diets rich in leafy greens to a lower risk of developing cataracts. These foods don't just help those already facing eye disease, they may delay or prevent problems in the first place. Another benefit is that lutein and zeaxanthin accumulate over time. The more consistently you eat them, the stronger your natural sunglasses become. Here's a question I often ask my patients when you look at your plate. Do you see something green at least once a day? If the answer is no, that's a missed opportunity for your eyes. Adding spinach or kale doesn't have to be complicated. Toss a handful of spinach into scrambled eggs, blend kale into a smoothie, or make a simple salad with olive oil and lemon. It's a small change that can create a powerful shield for your vision, protecting your eyes from the everyday stress of aging, light exposure, and oxidative damage. 3. Nuts and seeds. Vitamin E defense. Almonds, walnuts, flax seeds, and sunflower seeds are more than just convenient snacks. They are powerful allies for your eyes. These foods are rich in vitamin E, a fat-soluble antioxidant that helps protect cells from oxidative stress. Oxidative stress is one of the leading causes of age-related eye damage, and vitamin E acts like a shield, slowing that process down. Clinical trials, including data from the age-related eye disease study, found that high doses of vitamin E, especially when combined with other antioxidants, reduced the progression of advanced macular degeneration by about 25%. That's a meaningful difference for people trying to preserve their vision. I often encourage my patients to think of nuts and seeds as protective fuel. Robert, a 70-year-old man I worked with, used to snack on cookies every evening. We switched that habit to a handful of almonds instead. Over time, he not only lost weight and felt more energetic, but his retinal scans showed healthier tissue. Another patient, Linda, 75, added walnuts and flax seeds to her morning oatmeal, Within months, her cholesterol improved, her eyes felt less dry, and her ophthalmologist noticed her macular health was stable. These small shifts can add up to life-changing results. Research also highlights the benefits of combining vitamin E with omega-3 fatty acids, which are abundant in walnuts and flax seeds. Together, they strengthen cell membranes and improve circulation to the retina. This dual action means better resilience against both oxidative stress and inflammation. So here's something to reflect on. When was the last time you made nuts and seeds a regular part of your meals instead of an occasional treat? A small handful, about an ounce a day, is enough to give your body the eye-protecting dose of vitamin E it needs. Sprinkle sunflower seeds on a salad, add flaxseed to yogurt, or keep a jar of almonds on the counter for easy snacking. It's a simple choice, but for your eyes, it can make all the difference in how clearly you see the world as the years go by. 2. Sweet potatoes. Slow energy, strong eyes. Sweet potatoes are one of the most underrated foods for vision health. Like carrots, they are packed with beta-carotene, which your body converts into vitamin A to support the retina and prevent night blindness. But what makes sweet potatoes unique is their ability to stabilize blood sugar. Sudden spikes and crashes in blood sugar can damage the fragile blood vessels in the eyes, particularly in older adults and those with diabetes. By providing slow, steady energy, sweet potatoes help protect these vessels from unnecessary stress. They also contain anthocyanins, the same powerful antioxidants found in blueberries, which add another layer of protection against oxidative damage in the retina. Research published in the Journal of Medicinal Food has shown that anthocyanins improve microcirculation in the eyes and reduce inflammation, both of which are essential for maintaining clear, sharp vision. A study from the American Diabetes Association also found that diets rich in low-glycemic foods like sweet potatoes reduce the risk of diabetic retinopathy, a condition that causes vision loss when blood sugar is not well controlled. I remember a patient named Joseph, a 71-year-old retired teacher living with type 2 diabetes. He used to rely heavily on white bread and pasta, and his eye exam showed early signs of vessel damage. We made a simple swap, replacing some of his refined carbs with baked sweet potatoes a few times a week. 6 months later, not only was his blood sugar more stable, but his eye doctor noted improvements in the health of his retinal vessels. Joseph told me he felt more energized and no longer experienced the mid-afternoon crashes he once did. Sweet potatoes are also versatile and easy to prepare. You can bake them whole, mash them like regular potatoes, or slice them into wedges and roast them until crisp. Pairing them with a drizzle of olive oil not only makes them more flavorful, but also helps your body absorb the beta-carotene more effectively. So here's something to ask yourself. When was the last time you swapped a starchy side dish for sweet potatoes? A simple change at the dinner table can lower blood sugar swings, give you steady energy, and provide your eyes with nutrients they need to stay strong well into your 70s and beyond. 1. Broccoli, the overlooked superfood. Broccoli is often overlooked, yet it is one of the most complete foods you can eat for your eyes. Beyond being a source of vitamins and fiber, it contains sulforaphane, a compound that activates protective enzymes in the body and helps shield delicate eye tissue from UV light and oxidative stress. A study from Johns Hopkins University found that sulforaphane significantly reduced cellular damage in the retina caused by ultraviolet exposure, suggesting that this vegetable acts almost like natural sunblock from the inside out. Broccoli also delivers a powerful trio of eye-protecting nutrients: lutein, vitamin C, and beta-carotene. Lutein filters harmful blue light and supports macular health. Vitamin C strengthens blood vessels in the eyes and slows the development of cataracts, and beta-carotene provides the building blocks for vitamin A, which is essential for night vision. Eating broccoli regularly is like giving your eyes 3 layers of defense in a single food. I recall Linda, a 68-year-old patient who began adding broccoli to her meals 3 times a week. She told me that after 6 months she noticed less glare when driving at night, and her eye exam confirmed her macula was healthier. Another patient, James, 70, was skeptical but agreed to try steaming broccoli alongside his dinners. Within a few months he not only felt more energetic, but he also reported less eye strain when reading in the evening. What many people don't realize is that broccoli is most effective when cooked lightly, steamed, or sautéed, because this preserves sulforaphane and allows the nutrients to be absorbed more efficiently. Adding a drizzle of olive oil can boost absorption even further. So here's something worth considering. When was the last time you made broccoli a regular part of your meals instead of treating it as a side you skip over? Sometimes the foods we take for granted, the ones sitting quietly in the produce aisle, are the very foods that can protect our vision the most. A few servings a week might be one of the simplest, smartest choices you can make for your eyes. So there you have it, 8 everyday foods that act like natural medicine for your eyes. Carrots, eggs, salmon, blueberries, spinach and kale, nuts and seeds, sweet potatoes, and broccoli. Simple foods that can strengthen your retina, defend against cataracts, slow macular degeneration, and keep your vision sharper for years to come. The big takeaway is this. Vision loss after 60 isn't always just aging. It's often the result of years of poor nutrition and oxidative stress. But the good news is it's never too late to fight back. Every meal you choose is either fueling damage or building protection. The power really is on your plate. My challenge for you is simple starting this week. Add at least 2 of these foods into your daily routine. Small choices add up, and over time they can change the way you see the world. Thank you so much for watching. If you found this video helpful, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to the channel. Your support helps us create more science-based health content designed to keep you strong, independent, and thriving. Take care of yourself, protect your eyes, and I'll see you in the next video.